Welcome to everybody. We're so excited to be here. Because is there anything more exciting than a book launch? No. Not for this.
No, not for me today.
No, not at all. So a huge congratulations to Ben Katt. I meant to ask you ahead of time to make sure.
Nailed the last name.
Yeah. Author of The Way Home, Discovering the Hero's Journey to Wholeness at Midlife. Just out from St. Martin's Essentials today. Let's get the interactive part of the night started with a big second round of applause for Ben. So here's a quick sketch of our hour together, which is going to go faster than any of us can even get a handle on. Because the book has just come out, and most of you haven't yet had the chance to read it. I'll do a quick intro. Then Ben will read a little bit from the book. We'll have a 30-minute discussion, and then open the conversation up to questions, as I know you'll enjoy talking with Ben as well. And so we're going to get started. You're set for your part after I'm done?
I'm good to go.
All right. So I just realized I have to turn my page here while I hold a microphone, so that's a whole different. Come on. Okay. When considering a way to introduce this book to you, I kept returning to something about the book that might surprise you considering the subject matter. This is a fun book, and Ben is a funny narrator. Yes, it's a book about saving your own life, or as Ben will explain, getting your heart back. And it's a book about shedding what isn't serving you and searching doggedly for what will. And it's a book that will lead you to discoveries and profundities, insight and clarity, but it's also a really fun time. As adventure stories should be. As book stories about quests should be. Here we are talking jaguars and owls and hummingbirds, bones, altars, and yes, a talking cactus. As a narrator of his own journey and a guide to ours, Ben Katt is delightfully unreserved, even as he brings his deep knowledge of spiritual tradition and the universality of mythology to bear upon essential quality of life questions. Ben reminds us that this journey can be fun, because if we long to pursue wholeness, that pursuit will ask things of us, things we might be hesitant to do, things that might be hard for us to do, that make us feel vulnerable, sad, embarrassed, lost, as we advance on our path to healing. As he pursued the reclamation of his own heart, Ben asked those same things of himself. And in The Way Home, he shares his journey with a sort of brave enthusiasm and good humor that then buoys us for the challenge, for setting out on a journey of our own. And I have no doubt that you will feel that even more so at the end of tonight's conversation. Ben Katt, thank you for this book. Let's jump in.
Thanks so much, Sally. Appreciate you taking the time to read this book and share those thoughts. It means a lot. So I'm just going to say a brief word about myself for a second to give you some context. I know a lot of you in here, and it's really wonderful to see people from different parts of my life. There's someone I went to high school with, there's neighbors and my parents and family. I have people from Good City Brewing where I've worked on and off over the last year and a half. And all sorts of other friends, and my nephew over here who's going to ask some hard questions later. So, but thanks everyone for being here. I sometimes have a hard time, as you might as well, like defining who you are and what you do, but I would say my time these days here in Milwaukee is spent as a meditation teacher. I have my business is called Mind MKE. I teach meditation courses and facilitate well-being experiences for companies and organizations. I'm also a writer. You can find more of my writing on Substack, and occasionally host at Good City Brewing downtown, as I mentioned earlier. And really, the common thread throughout my story is that for the last 20 years, part of it as an ordained minister, my work has been at the intersection of spirituality, community, and social healing. So that's some context for what I'm about and what I care about. And with that, I will read a section from The Way Home. If you don't have your heart. One rainy fall morning, I was charging up a hill near the end of a jog. Any other day, I would dash around the corner and sprint the last 10 blocks to my house. But this day was different. When I reached the top of the hill, my legs burning and music blasting in my ears, a string of words from within suddenly interrupted me. "If you don't have your heart, you have nothing," the inner voice said. It stopped me dead in my tracks. Breathing deeply, I pulled out my blaring earbuds and placed my hands at my side. I couldn't run anymore. I knew exactly what this voice was telling me, and it wasn't about my heart rate. It was about my soul. In that moment, it dawned on me that for a long time, I had been slowly and quietly losing my heart amid the ordinary stuff of being human. Marriage and family and community and work. The problem wasn't just that my life was busy and full of commitments. The bigger issue was how I was approaching everything. It would take years for me to realize this, as the pages of this book will prove. But for the previous year, the past decade, and probably my entire adulthood, I had been ruled by a three-headed monster, striving after success, pursuing perfection, and constantly seeking the approval of others. I had come to believe that these were the only ways I could earn the love and acceptance of others. The sad but inevitable consequence of chasing after external validation through these things was that I had become estranged from my own internal world, from who I truly am, from my heart. It's actually pretty remarkable if I think about it. In my work as a social entrepreneur, community organizer, and neighborhood pastor, I had spent nearly a decade coming alongside vulnerable neighbors who were well acquainted with trauma and experiencing some brutal combination of homelessness, addiction, mental illness, and sexual exploitation. My work alleviated suffering and fostered belonging. I helped countless people find their way home. And yet there I was, lost, feeling like I didn't belong, and trapped in my own form of suffering. You can't make this stuff up. At the same time, it also makes a lot of sense that I wasn't receiving for my own life what I was preaching and practicing for others. First, because my line of work was perceived by many to be good and virtuous, and since it didn't offer the dangling carrots of paychecks, promotions, and power, I fooled myself into thinking I was immune to the obsession with achievement, perfection, and performance that dominates so much of our society. I was in the helping professions, after all. But I was absolutely in on the game of looking for fulfillment in some external idea or possession or status or opinion. The trick was that I was just playing the game in my own way. Second, I failed to see that I was losing my heart because I wouldn't admit it was possible. My work brought me to the front lines of trauma. The stories I heard and the wounds I witnessed were unimaginable. It made complete sense that many of these neighbors' lives had spiraled out of control. But my life wasn't that dramatic. No divorce, no death in my immediate family, no illness, no financial hardship, no abuse, not to mention all the oppression I avoided as a white, straight male American. But as I would discover, I did carry my own pain. I just needed to give myself permission to acknowledge it. We all do, no matter how loud or quiet. Because if we don't acknowledge it, we keep sending it on to the next generation, to our communities, and to the world. Pain that is not processed is passed on. That morning message, "If you don't have your heart, you have nothing," interrupted all of these false narratives and opened my eyes to my lost heart. On one level, it rattled me enough for me to notice how I was becoming withdrawn in all my relationships and signaled my burnout. At a deeper level, it put a spotlight on my fundamental confusion about who I am and why I'm here. The inner voice declared that I had a choice to make. I could choose to continue down the achievement-oriented, approval-seeking path on which I was slowly wasting away, or I could choose to walk a different way. I could seek after something else, my true self, my soul, my heart, my home.
Thank you for reading that section, and I have approximately 15 questions that could just come out of that. But we're going to start with some basic, sort of fundamental questions. And the first one really is for anyone who's not familiar with the hero's journey, which is the feature of this subtitle, and Joseph Campbell's work, and the sort of the historiography of mythology, if you would talk a little bit about why you chose that framework for the book and how it plays out for the structure of the book.
Yeah, so Joseph Campbell was a mid-20th century mythologist who interacted with the works of all sorts of folks before him, but he really identified, as he looked at myths and fairy tales and folklore and religious traditions across time and place, he saw this common thread running through it all. I'll say there's, for those who want to do a deep dive, there's critiques of his work, there's questions. Some would say he oversimplifies things, but I think his work offers a really valuable tool. And the basic pattern that he identifies is 3 movements. He says, in these old stories, there's always he talked about the departure, leaving home, and then initiation and return. So I end up kind of talking about these in a little bit different way. But I would say after I had undergone this 5-6 year journey of my life, I was studying his work and reading it. And as I read it, I thought, this is what I experienced. Like, this is what I went through. And I thought, instead of having 17 steps like he does, if you dig into his work, he's got like 17 steps. I thought, like, what would it be like to share his work, interact with his work in a way that was more reflective of my personal story and experience, and do so in a way that's even more accessible. So I have 10 steps, and the 3 things are leaving the familiar, falling into the unknown, and rising to wholeness. One last thing, just to contextualize Joseph Campbell, if you aren't familiar with his work, the reality is you are, because he became, later in his career, a major influence in Hollywood. So like George Lucas, for example, was like reading his stuff and said, that's how I want to tell stories. So you can see this template or pattern throughout. When you're like, why are all the Star Wars, like when they make 3 more, why are they the same as the first ones? It's not just because they're trying to repeat that, it's because they're trying to interact with the same template that Campbell was talking about.
I was going to mention that too, and in the book you mentioned, the construction of Marvel movies, and it's a very common, so if you're not familiar with Campbell, you are familiar with this kind of storytelling. And the other thing I want to look at for the choice of the subtitle of the book, it mentions midlife, right? So we all have a relationship, depending on your age, with the concept of midlife. And I think that after reading this book, that this book is incredibly universal. It is not to be pigeonholed into one period of anyone's life. And that in actuality, I would ask you if you agree with this, that the midlife for me, in context of this book, is the before and the after the journey, right? So you can be 25 or you can be 52 and still reap the same rewards from the process of answering the call and exploring the darkness and coming out and coming home.
I'm going to borrow that because I really like the before-after. I often say that midlife, which, there were debates internally of which I had no say in this, and Daniel of Boswell Books would know how this stuff works better than me, but maybe at midlife will help sell more, we'll see. But I think it's interesting because what I like to say is, let's not think of midlife as an age range, which some would say maybe it's like 35 to 55, but you could say that's shifting even now for various reasons. Part of why that's relevant is, like, this was a early midlife journey for me. So I was like 34, 35. Some things were surfacing in my life and wanting to get my attention that can only come after a certain amount of lived and accumulated experiences, right? So that's why at a certain age, some of this can happen. At the same time, I love to really say, what if we think of midlife as a stage of life? So not age range, but like you're saying, it's a hinge point. So before and after, it's about getting to a point where, whether it's because of something loud and dramatic or something really quiet and subtle, realizing that the way, for me, the way I was moving through the world just didn't fit anymore. My operating patterns had gotten me so far and been helpful, but at some point it started to hinder me and really hurt how I was able to show up in the world. So it's about leaving behind that, not necessarily knowing, this is the terrifying part, not really knowing what you're moving towards exactly or who you are on the other side, and like going through that dark night of the soul in between.
I think in the section that you read, you addressed this a little bit about who this book is for, and here, we've addressed it to some degree. Anyone who watches a good Hollywood film, anyone who experiences a hinge point like that as well in their lives where they feel like they need to take another direction. And you mentioned that while some people might feel like these are the kinds of changes that we welcome into our lives, or we not necessarily welcome, but are forced into our lives, comes as a result of disaster, comes as a result of an illness, comes with a result of realizing our mortality, that it can be something that is a little more subtle, a little more nuanced. It can be a voice that you hear, but it can also be what you say is questioning whether you're living in alignment, and that you won't always know what you need liberation from. And I think that's a great way to give anyone a basic tool for assessing where they are in life. What are some other questions that you found yourself asking that other people can use to figure out whether their feeling of discontent is because there is a call that they're not yet hearing?
Yeah. I think it's like really, and I spell this out at the very beginning of the book, but this idea that, just to give some more context to what you're saying, like, I think our society loves like the story of everything falling apart and then like the person rising from the ashes like a phoenix. Like, we love these dramatic stories, and these are the ones they probably sell a lot of books, they like movies and biographies. Like, we give a lot of attention to these stories. And you know what, that's great, they can inspire us, but there's also a way that by only centering those stories, we actually fail to notice the everyday, ordinary ways that our heart is slipping away. So basically saying, like, you don't have to, end up getting canceled or getting a mugshot or hitting rock bottom. Like, there's a way that you might still be losing your heart while you're on the sidelines at your kid's soccer game, or doing a job that you care about, or in the best shape of your life. So, but in terms of context, like, really my entryway into it, and I think this is one of the big ones in our culture, would be a season of burnout. So mental, physical, emotional exhaustion can often be a sign, not just like, oh, I'm doing too much, like as I said in what I read, but there's something about how I'm approaching life in general that is really working against me, and I need to evaluate that. So I think burnout would be one, but also just a simmering sense of discontent sometimes that maybe you can't quite put your finger on it. You might want to jump to and say, oh, it's this relationship, or it's my job, but it's actually this malaise that's a little quieter. It's also helpful to pay attention to that.
I was thinking while I was reading that we're terrible at diagnosing ourselves, right? Like, we think that it's something external, or we don't want to go through the tunnel to come out the other side, and we wouldn't choose that as much as we would think that we need to quit a job, or quit a relationship, or buy a new house. All of the ways that we want to avoid confronting exactly what you're describing here. Poetry plays a strong part in, I know, your sort of creative exploration of yourself, and in the book. And you quote Mary Oliver's poem, The Summer Day, where she asks, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" But reading your book, I was also reminded of her poem, Wild Geese, which many of you might be familiar with, which opens with, "You do not have to be good." Because goodness and being good was a big part of the work that you do and were doing, and was part of the burnout and something you had to decide to leave. I think that's one of the biggest challenges people have, is feeling like in order to live up to the expectations of the people around them, to be you use different phrases, whether it's having a mask on or whether it's a false identity, but creating this persona that you now feel sort of indebted to in your life, and leaving that behind, I think, is a very difficult thing for people. Can you talk a little bit about how what you fed within yourself by being good in a very good and generous way, and not relinquishing the responsibility to be good in the society, but also being good to yourself?
Yeah. It's a lot of goods in there. So the image that's coming to my mind, which is a brief little story I tell in the book, is in my former life, I was a mascot. So I had a brief stint in the Arena Football League. I wasn't like NFL, and I wasn't like the game mascot that's like shooting a t-shirt gun. I was just like the send this guy to the elementary school for the event kind of mascot. So met a lot of creepy clowns and things like that. But I used that. There was basically like my first day on the job, I remember them telling me, like there was this intern, he's like telling me and like 3 other college students who were gonna share the same like rug-like costume. He's like, never take your head off, and don't ever speak with your voice. Okay, which led to me like getting beat up by some kids once, but that's a whole other story. But I realized like later in life, and I kind of use this in the stories, like those were rules that I followed in real life. This sense of don't let anyone see your true face, and don't speak with your real voice. And behind that was this desire to be good. Okay, like in the sense of to fit in, to play by the rules, to be loyal, to be a helper, to not ruffle any feathers. Part of this is, if some of you are like middle children out there, maybe you can relate to this a little bit. So part of it's that, part of it is like growing up in the religious community, which gave me a lot of gifts, but also there's sort of a, hey, you gotta play by the rules if you don't want to get rejected here. There's subtle undertone. So, you know, and then I became an ordained minister and was doing good, meaningful work. So it was hard to step away from all of those goods. And it was hard to admit like that actually there might be some way, and I'm not saying like, I'll go and like be morally reckless and cause harm. I just went there, what else is behind that, that kind of narrow version of myself? What else is beneath the surface? What other parts of myself might come out if I'm not so fixated on this way of showing up, which really was a way of trying to protect myself and fit in?
I think the thing that struck me about that was just this sort of, it's external acknowledgement. You talk a little bit about performance, and you talk a little bit about how being that person continues to feed you, and at some point you, perhaps figuratively, but later on in the book, address sort of literally, like you have to fast yourself away from that person and that kind of feeding, and find that source of growth and energy somewhere else. Okay, so I want to do one more like topic about the book question.
Let's do it.
And then we'll get into some more of the story. So this might be a slightly thorny topic, but I think it's an important one. Okay?
Let's go.
So this book, we've talked about the hero's journey, we've talked about midlife, and now I think, I don't know the statistics, I did not prepare that well, but essentially, I think we often regard the wellness industrial complex that is happening in our sort of society right now to be particularly attending to women. And in some ways that's a very bad thing, right? Because this is problematic, because we've historically told women that if only they change and if only they're different, then maybe they'll be better, right? And that is sometimes what we think of wellness as being. One thing that we don't see a lot of is wellness with regard to men's experience in the world. And I think this book is so necessary in that way, because it's not about going out and hunting wild game. Not
Lord knows I couldn't do that.
And it's not about lifting heavy weights, and it's not necessarily about finding your feminine. It feels very much like an authentic story that is very seldomly told. And I'm wondering if you were cognizant while you were writing it that you were writing this book for everyone, or if you were writing this book for men, or if you feel like there's a fine line that you were careful to walk there.
So I wrote the whole thing for myself. meaning when I set out to write it, I was like, I am writing the book I wish I had that day that I had the if you don't have your heart, you have nothing. I'm gonna write the book that I wish I like came home to, and that would have been like a map for me as I wandered through the wilderness. Fortunately, I had given my background, like I'm exposed to like a wealth of knowledge and wisdom, so I know how to sift through that stuff, and that could speak to my soul and give me guidance in a deep way. But I also was like, I want to write something that's like is more story centered and yeah, more vulnerable and real, not just like these nice quotes you can reflect on, right? So fundamentally, like first and foremost, I wrote it for myself. So naturally, in that sense, it's like I do think there was, in that early stage, it was like, well, what would be a helpful resource for men? Probably men my age, like those kinds of who are dealing with things that I was dealing with. I think as I got, and by the way, so I wrote it and I finished the whole thing before I let anyone read it, so which you're not supposed to do, I guess, but it's all worked out. But I guess what I would add to that is, yeah, the more I look at it, it's almost like I was, being real and authentic and sharing my story, there's a way it's like forging a way between, like there is some men's work stuff out there, there's some really helpful stuff. There's also some that's, some of my take on it is it doesn't express the same sort of kindness towards former versions of ourselves. There's a little more of a, like there's a place for anger and rage and to express that. But I think some of the movements maybe are leaning into that a little more. I guess at the end of the day, sort of a complicated question, but in part, I think at its core, it's also not wanting to treat wellness or well-being as like this sort of surface level, I just got to clean up my act, look better, because it also can be dangerous that way. But how do we just create something that's honest about like, hey, we all have pain. We're not about comparing what that is, but we all need to be real and face it and deal with that. We need to grieve it. We need to allow ourselves to like not run from our wounds and experience healing. So I guess vulnerability would be like this core piece of the story.
Thank you, because my next thing was, which is a good segue into vulnerability. And I think we've addressed that there. So let's take a look now at what's within the cover of the book, right? So you set out to, I won't say rewrite the hero's journey, but to use it to reflect on your experience and give people stepping stones in order to perhaps lay a path for themselves. And can you give us just a little bit of the arc of the book? What do we follow here?
Yeah, so 3 sections and an epilogue. The 3 sections are leaving the familiar, falling into the unknown, and rising to wholeness. Each of those has 3 sub-steps that are like steps that are very kind of accessible, memorable. I'll say more about steps in a second, but the last, then the epilogue is like a step 10, which I'll just, spoiler alert, it's called Begin Again, because the idea is this journey is always ongoing. Like we arrive somewhere, we discover something, and then guess what? There's an invitation to a new way of being that might emerge. There's a new call to adventure. So yeah, that's how the book is organized. And steps, I kind of like, I like calling them steps because it gives the illusion that they're easy. So when in fact these are really complex tasks and like represent deep inner work that we need to do. And while in many ways they might be like, you might experience them sequentially, the reality is they're always kind of overlapping and intertwined and start over again. So that's kind of the structure.
There's a popular meme out there on Instagram or whatever that has it's like 2 different images, and one of them is, this is how people want change to look, which is ascending, and then here is what change actually looks like, which is a big knotty mess, that hopefully comes out at the end in an ascendant place. One of the things that you talk about that I think makes this guide really accessible and usable is ritual practice. And I know that plays a big part in your life now. And we will get to talking about some of the stories that have you out traveling and walking in the wilderness and all of those things, but on a sort of day-to-day level, for people who want to seek a certain kind of insight into themselves, how does ritual practice play a part?
Yeah, so the ritual practices are like this main thread, and it's kind of woven throughout the book, and also there's a little reference guide in the back, so you can find out where these things are. But the idea is I present these things that I experienced on my journey to be a jumping off point for you if you want to go deeper. I'll just share kind of what was really foundational, and this was a couple weeks after this like burnout moment, as I was starting to like peel back the layers. What I realized is like I'd been going so fast, I hadn't taken any time to like listen, and I needed to. And so I was like open. I was open to God, to the universe, like give me some message. And a sequence of events, all in one day, led to me coming across this like 1950s, 1960s Mad Men era Jaguar automobile ad. Like, I'm not kidding you. And it was like I came upon this thing, and the slogan was grace, space, pace. And I saw those words, and I was like, these are for me, like as crazy as that sounds. And for the Jaguar, it meant like, elegant and roomy and fast. But for me, who was like blazing through life and not paying attention to my own inner world, right away, it was a cue and an invitation to some practices. So like the pace practice or the space practice, for example, for me became solitude, which, solitude, it's intentional aloneness. And there's so many ways we can express that, whether that's in journaling or yoga or walking in the wilderness or in nature or at a local park. The pace part of it was really like, guess what? Slowing down. And so that, I didn't have to look too far. Like the Christian tradition that I come from, as if you're also from like the Jewish tradition, there's this practice of rest. So Sabbath in my tradition, or Shabbat in the Jewish tradition, it's an idea of like a day of rest that you mark and set out apart from the other days. And so what does it look like to be a little more loose with that? Meaning, what are rhythms of rest you can build into your life, or rhythms of rest as it relates to the supercomputers we walk around with in our pocket? Can I like go offline for a little bit? So, and then Grace had its own, which really was the core practice, was mostly receiving hospitality. So those were foundational throughout the journey, and really for anyone, I think, that's a great slogan. So go for it.
I think the reason I wanted to bring that in, and I think we've touched base with each other the first time after I did an interview with Catherine May and her new book, Enchantment, or her most recent book, Enchantment, and in it she talks a lot about recognition of the ordinary, of creating opportunities to hear your inner voice. And I think one of the things that I take away from this book is that for anyone who's ever felt uncomfortable making sure that you step over a line in the sidewalk, or throwing salt over your shoulder, or any of the things that we think are superstition, or anything that we do if we light a candle on a certain day, and we somehow are very self-conscious about like that we feel like divine presence or intuition, or the voices that we need to hear to direct us in our lives are just supposed to come upon us. Like, we don't have to do the work to welcome it. And ritual practice then gives us that opportunity to make space for it to happen, and not a predictability necessarily, but an openness.
Yeah, like I talk about it, it's like a way of developing so these practices help us develop our mystical muscles, which is my way of saying like this sense of enhanced awareness and openness to hear the messages that, and by the way, there's a whole part on this, like whatever you want to call it, like God or the universe or your soul or the force, whatever you want to call it, like that there are ways that life is speaking to us. And so how do we work to develop the capacity to pay attention? And this isn't just like some kind of woo-woo weird thing. The work of Dr. Lisa Miller, I mentioned in the book, she's got this book called The Awakened Brain, and in her groundbreaking research, she shows, like the science shows that our brains are hardwired for this sense of like spirituality and spiritual connection and meaning making from the substance of life?
So we can't allow everyone to feel like this story was only lightness and greatness and wonder, right? We have to deal with the darkness, right? And the sort of middle section of the pathway.
It's my favorite section.
It actually, I probably wrote on this piece of paper that says it's my favorite section. I am going to read a little bit from it. If you can introduce us to what the falling or darkness or leaving is, well, I find what I want to read.
Yeah, so the middle section, the falling into the unknown, the 3 steps, easy steps, right? It's befriending the darkness, befriend the darkness, wander in the wild, and face your death.
So in the book, and one of the reasons why I wanted to read from the book is that there are some lovely passages in here that this is not strictly about steps, right? Mm-hmm. Like this is about the soul and this is about the human experience, and Ben does such a nice job of capturing some of that in the language. And the section I want to read here is in the subtitle is "What Happened in the Darkness," and I'll try not to give too much away, but I'll skip a little bit of it. But quoting Ben here, "We often chase after light in the world. The light, we think, is where we find answers or clarity or guarantees, something steady and certain to attach to. But to descend into the dark depths or find yourself there is to refuse to give your allegiance to anyone or anything else but your true self. No system or technique, no construct of God or social pressure, no father or mother or lover, no imposter identity, no mascot costume, no illusion. In the empty darkness, there is only you, the true wellspring of your love and power. And this is the core, essential you that cannot be taken away and cannot be extinguished. In the darkness, I arrived at the end of myself, which was also the beginning of myself."
Thank you.
It's a wonderful book. Sorry, I got distracted. So it's a wonderful, this we could go into wombs and caves, and we could talk a lot about what darkness means, but I think we all have a relationship with what darkness means to us in our experience. And what you're saying here, though, I think is, in that same way that we talked about ritual practice, is that going into the darkness actually allows you to meet yourself. Mm-hmm. Is that how you would what else do we learn there?
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely like all the things are sort of stripped away. All the things we've come to rely on or the ways we perform and show up, the mask we wear, like they don't work in the darkness anymore. And so, I mean, you have to come back to the only thing that is there, and it is yourself. You're forced to face yourself and sit and be with yourself.
So we are running up against the time that I was going to open it up for questions. I have 2 more I want to sneak in, though. Okay, so the first one is, because we haven't gotten to the ascendant part, but while we are talking about the darkness, I would love it if you would pick a story from any of your adventure, whether it is in the woods or in the wilderness or in the desert. What is an example of where you ended up having to really strip down to the essential you and have an experience that you may have avoided in any other context except in this ritual practice?
Okay, well, I won't do one where I literally stripped. Sorry, Mom, there's a naked scene, you know that.
I did set you up for it in case you
Okay, well, I do like that story.
Okay, we'll avoid it.
So the one that I will share, it was like in the summer in Seattle, where a lot of the book is set. That's where we lived at the time. And for Father's Day that year, Cherie and the kids had gotten me this, a session with a friend of ours who facilitates ritual experiences. And so I go down this park that I've been to like hundreds of times for like class low tide field trips and birthday parties and hiking and trail running and all these different things. I meet my friend Vanya there. And I'm coming, we had a previous conversation, but I'm there to do, without getting too into it, but this idea of a severance ceremony. Ooh, sounds intense. This idea of like I was severing or disconnecting from certain ways that I was showing up in the world. I was ritually expressing that, symbolically enacting it, so as to say to myself when I look back, like, I've made this progress, I've moved past this thing, right? That's what rituals do. They are a symbolic way of expressing maybe an internal or spiritual reality. So anyways, it involves like going out into the park, and it's only an hour long, but I go into this area of the park that I didn't know existed somehow. I feel like it magically appeared that day. And the instruction was basically just to be open and, basically just notice things and follow them. And so before I knew it, I kind of went across this little stream. I'm going down this path, and I'm like, no one else is out here. And so I just took my shirt off, and my son Jackson was 10 at the time. I felt like Jackson, who was always swinging like a stick in the air. It was a sword, it was a bow and arrow, and a baseball bat, whatever it is. And so I just did that. It was like really playful, this imaginative thing. Next thing you know, I'm like going this like fallen tree over a little ravine. I'm crossing it, and I get to the other, like, if I fall, I'm gonna break some bones. And we had a family vacation scheduled the next day. I didn't really think about that, but I crossed and I like crouched like a jaguar. This will all make sense when you read the book, okay? I mean, it won't make sense, but then I continue down the path, and suddenly I feel like this heavy weight on the back of my head, like really close. And I was like, that was a big bird. Like a big bird just was right behind me. And I turn and I look up the slope, and there this like perched up, has just landed about 30 yards away, is this massive barred owl. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. Like I go out here just in this brief little experience. I've never seen an owl here, but then it like flies. It's 20 yards away from me in this other tree branch. And then it flies again, and now it's 10 yards away from me. And I'm like, okay. I lift my arm out. It didn't land on my arm, but like the people at the zoo with the glove on. It didn't land, but it looked at me, and we had this, like, felt like an exchange. And I'm just like in awe, because I'm thinking, it's like, here's this nocturnal creature. It's like 11 in the morning. It's a sunny day. I've never seen an owl in that park, no matter how many times I've been there. And then also, like, at a very basic Harry Potter level, I know that an owl, it's like a messenger. It has a message to deliver. It's a symbol of another realm. And I also had a sense, as I was confirmed later, like an owl is often like a symbol or like of death. And so here I was marking this sort of death to a part of myself, and I meet an owl in the woods. So I don't explain how I was open to things like that happening, but man, they were. I came back, and we did this closing ceremony with Vanya, and then Cherie showed up, my wife, and I start telling them, and Vanya, my friend, I think she's like, no, you weren't supposed to make up a story. You were just supposed to. I'm like, no, I really had this experience with the owl.
I think that's just a wonderful example, not only of the sort of humor and like the brave enthusiasm that you display throughout the book, but that it requires to go on a journey like this, right? And so we come to the end of our journey, which is just, again, the start of the next season of the journey, right? Where you are faced with integration, right? So you've heard the calling, you've left, you've explored, you've walked, you've gone through the darkness, and now you're expected to just bring your new self to your old life. Yeah. And you say that you may not fit your life anymore. So what are the challenges of integration and actually sustaining this new self? Okay, yes. Okay, I want to hit on the prickly thing of wellness from earlier, in that there's a lot out there right now, like, oh, I went and had this psychedelic experience, or I went on retreat in Bali, or I did this breathwork workshop and had this like crazy experience. Those can all be helpful tools, so I'm not saying don't, but what's often missing with a lot of these modalities is the sense of, how do I come back to my everyday life, having discovered what I discovered, having learned what I learned, and how do I bring that into my life
and show up in such a way so that I retain the gains of what I've discovered, right? That I sort of stay anchored in this new, fuller version of myself, but also in a way that's not like detached and aloof and, quite frankly, irrelevant to the world around us. So really the back third is like, part of it is like, if you watch a movie and we're thinking of this hero's journey pattern, usually it's like, well, and they got the treasure or saved the person, and then there's a 2-minute clip at the end and the movie's over. Like the return home is never really like described very well. So it's very important to me, and part of this was because I had to work it out in my own life, is to say, how can we start to think about what this reintegration process looks like? And I will say, because I want to make sure this note is sounded here, while this is a journey, like only you can go on, like you can't live vicariously through anyone else, no one else can do it for you. Like at the end of the day, it's not like an individualistic journey, okay? You're gonna need help along the way. And more importantly, like any aspect of self-discovery that doesn't lead to you contributing to the well-being and the flourishing of other human beings in your community and the world, guess what? There's still going to be work to do. So it always is this call, and this journey is always going to send you back into the world to be an expression of love and light. That's the spoiler alert, so get ready for that.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because you do say, and you're very cognizant throughout the book, that to heal yourself is to heal the world. Like we are one piece of a much bigger puzzle, and the best thing that we can do is be our best selves, I suppose, within that that whole fabric. Hopefully we've given you a sense of the arc of Ben's journey and the tone of the book and the value of what is in between the covers. Even though Ben Katt's, I know this, right? Even though Ben Katt's personal journey is set in midlife, there's a timeless application of his framework here for becoming open to change and living life with intention, whether we do that at a young age and prevent a crisis point midlife, or we do it much later in life with a more keenly felt appreciation for the time that remains of our brief stay on this planet. There's much for everyone to gain from the way home, as it calls to us to become the hero of our own life, and then leads us along the path back to ourselves, where we will find the hero that already resides within. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you to Porchlight and Sally for spending time with my stories and your curiosity. Thanks to Boswell Books for having me. And like the question of help that you asked, I mean, I have a whole cloud of witnesses and people who supported me, like literally since I was born. Not just my parents, but like their dear friends. So many people in this room who have supported me along the way, and I wouldn't be who I am and without all of you. So thanks. And Henry, Thor is in this book, and Captain Marvel, and Doctor Strange in Iron Man. Okay? You don't have to read it, but just say it. Thank you.
Thank you.